Hi, everybody, both live and watching this later via the webcast. I am Tara Isabella Burton, and I am delighted to have Sarah Weinman here with me to talk crime fiction, and in particular, her newest book, Scoundrel: How a Convicted Murderer Persuaded the Women Who Loved Him, the Conservative Establishment, and the Courts to Set Him Free. For those of you who are not already familiar with Sarah's work, Sarah is the author of the aforementioned Scoundrel, named a Best Book of 2022 by Time, Esquire, CBC, and NPR, as well as The Real Lolita, named a Best Book of 2018 by NPR, BuzzFeed, The National Post, and many other places. She's also edited a number of anthologies, including Evidence of Things Seen, True Crime in an Era of Reckoning. She is the winner of the Antony Award for Best Nonfiction Critical Work, and she writes the monthly crime and mystery column for the New York Times Book Review. Thank you so much for being here, Sarah. I am so excited to get started.
It's a real pleasure to be here with you, Tara. Thank you.
As I mentioned in our green room, I absolutely loved Scoundrel. I found it completely fascinating, the story of this convicted murderer who seems, at least from an outside perspective, to be very obviously guilty, who manages, despite this, to convince some extremely high-profile people to lobby for his innocence and gets out. Even when there's sort of evidence of him in repeatedly saying he has committed this crime at various points in the courtroom and elsewhere. A very basic question: how did you first come across the story, and what made you just decide that this was the case that you wanted to make into a book?
So, the impetus for Scoundrel dates back almost 10 years now that I think about it. I published a magazine story that became the basis for my first book, The Real Lolita, in November 2014. And the next magazine feature that I pitched to the publication, called Hazlitt in Canada, was about William F. Buckley and Edgar Smith. And I'd heard about it maybe the year before or so. I'd known of a comparable case involving Norman Mailer and Jack Henry Abbott. And Abbott was a prisoner who Mailer corresponded with while he was writing the Executioner Song. And Mailer was so impressed with Abbott's writing, he helped spearhead a campaign to get him released. He was in prison for murder, and to have his prison writings collected in a volume called In the Belly of the Beast. And when that imploded, because Abbott, on the very day that his book was received a rave review from the Times, he had killed a restaurant worker named Richard Adden and was on the run for a little while. So the blowback on Mailer was just tremendous. And it was a case that I'd even known about, maybe going back to high school, but definitely college. But in reading about it, there had been a recent book on that story. And it mentioned in passing something about William F. Buckley befriending and advocating for Edgar Smith, this convicted murderer in New Jersey. And I thought, wait, what? I want to know more about this. What's it? So the more digging that I did, the more I thought that there was at least a magazine piece. And then, as I started doing further research and reporting, which included reaching out to different sources, initial correspondence with Edgar Smith, who was still alive then, I came to realize that if I did it as a magazine feature, it'd be minimum 30,000 words. And if that's the case, it might as well be a book. And that the women in his life who were still alive, namely his second ex-wife, but also people related to his first wife, that they just wouldn't talk to me as long as he was still alive. He was known to kind of cyber stalk people from prison, which is crazy, but he had like an outside conduit to help him do that. So I just thought, let me shelve this for a while. It wasn't like I wasn't lacking in things to do. I did have The Real Lolita to write and finish, other anthologies to edit, other features to work on. At the time, I still had a day job. And then, as I was finishing the first draft of The Real Lolita, I learned that Edgar Smith had died in prison. And I called my agent and said, okay, this project I've been mentioning to you, should I get a proposal ready? And he's like, yeah, sooner the better. So I wrote a feverish proposal draft in something like 24 hours because it was all in my head. And it just felt like this big download dump. And then I had many months to revise it. So by early, let me get the timeline right. I think by May of 2018. So it was just a few months before The Real Lolita was published, but there was already a lot of pre-pub stuff relating to it. We sold a proposal for Scoundrel, and that became my next book. So that is a very long-winded answer. And the short form is supposed to be a magazine story. Clearly, there was much more going on.
So I'm curious what sort of in terms of the thematic material, something that I kind of is a thorough line through all of your work that I've read is a kind of reassessment of our own fascination with crime as much as crime itself, the way in which sort of particular media narratives and about whose stories get told and whose murders are interesting and how this is kind of conceived of becomes part of the story itself. And in this case, the kind of celebrity culture of, I suppose, 60s, early 70s becomes part of the story. So I'm curious if you could sort of set the stage for us, both in terms of the broader celebrity culture of the time and how the sort of news media is playing into the sort of obsession with Smith, and also specifically kind of why is Bill Buckley involved of all people? Like, why
Well, that's
him?
actually how I was going to answer it, because I think if you're talking about 60s culture and celebrity, we forget that William F. Buckley really was kind of a celebrity, albeit of a countercultural variety, but that at the time that Edgar Smith was convicted of murdering 15-year-old Victoria Zelensky in 1957, that was the same year when Buckley, 2 years into his tenure as founder and editor of National Review, wrote an essay called "Why the South Must Prevail," which is essentially arguing that segregation is not a bad thing, and what's the matter with segregation. And of course, he got, rightfully so, a ton of blowback and controversy. But he had just he was building this career as this countercultural conservative pundit, starting with the book God and Man at Yale in 1951, which has never gone out of print and people are still reading and taking the same lessons from, apparently 70 some odd years later. And then he and his eventual brother-in-law, Brent Bozell, co-write a book called McCarthy and His Enemies, essentially arguing that, what's the matter with McCarthy? Like, that seems to be his, prevailing theme of, let me argue the other side of what seems to be common knowledge and conclusion. And that's also because Buckley himself, when he was at Yale, was a star debater, and that was his whole thing. Like, he loved to just engage people in conversations and argue with them, and do so with that big toothy grin on his face and his, an irrepressible charm. And you can see that if you go on YouTube and watch any episode of Firing Line that you wish. I mean, it really does come through. And that was the way that he was able to engage not just conservatives, but also liberals, many of whom he had as friends. And he had a going thing of, never mix politics with friendship. And if anything, I think he preferred having liberal friends because he could talk about arts and culture. And, one of the other key characters in Scoundrel is this book editor, Sophie Wilkins. And the way that they meet at Payon's, which was one of Buckley's go-to restaurants, it was around the corner from National Review's offices, and they have this brilliant lunch, and she's so charmed and bowled over by him, but he's also charmed and bowled over by her because they have like certain connections, including the pianist Ryle Turek, who's a Bach specialist, and Buckley himself loved to play Bach. So on the one hand, he's like doing all these things that are furthering sort of the conservative agenda, but conversely, he's also championing arts and culture and, going to Gstaad and hanging out and skiing with David Niven and John Kenneth Galbraith. And so, it was just, he's the kind of conservative that liberals could love, and they often did. And so Smith is convicted, and for 5 years, it's touch and go as to whether he'll be executed for this crime, which he claims innocence for. And it isn't until he gets the attention of a different National Review staffer, Donald Cox, who writes a piece for the Review. And from there, Smith and Buckley start to correspond and actually develop what Buckley thinks is a genuine friendship. But basically, Smith is conning him the whole time.
It was one of the elements of your book that I found most fascinating was the like the way in which there's sort of the story playing out first a murder and then the story playing out in prison, and then there's a separately almost a story of like the New York literati, and we see this particularly in correspondence between Wilkins and Buckley. And it seems very much that kind of insofar as Smith is successful, he's doing so because he is playing into like narratives, both political and personal, that these people kind of want or have a vested interest in. Did you get a sense, kind of, especially in reviewing this correspondence, how much did you go in kind of knowing that this was going to be a book about manipulating stories people are telling themselves, or was this something that came up in the process, particularly when you were sort of had access to some of these letters and correspondence and you saw a different side of these relationships?
I mean, at first, when I started on the project, the working title was The Convict and the Conservative, because at that point, I only really knew about Buckley and Smith's relationship and how that developed, and the fact that Buckley became his advocate and his champion and would write the foreword to Smith's book, Brief Against Death, but also that when he gets released in late 71, and by the end of 1976, he is back in prison for nearly killing another woman, spends the rest of his life there, and Buckley will write a long piece for Life magazine in 79 that is not a mea culpa, but it is sort of a re-examination of what happened and kind of fudges his own responsibility, which is a far cry from the piece that he had written in Esquire in 65, in which he made the case that Edgar Smith was innocent, and here's why, and he quotes from correspondence. And that would eventually get Sophie Wilkins' attention. So at the time that I start, I just think it's a story of Buckley and Smith. But I learn about this book editor, Sophie, and that she has correspondence and her archives are at Columbia University. So one day in 2016, because I have downtime, I know I want to work on this as an eventual book, but it's not fully at the proposal stage. And I do a Google search and this comes up. So I thought, let me just do some exploratory archival work, thinking that I'm just going to find professional correspondence between a book editor and her author. And then I get into the archives and then I find some really, really smutty stuff, because it turns out that there's a lot of correspondence between Sophie and Edgar, and that even though it starts off in this professional manner, it soon goes completely off the rails. And Edgar is sort of intuiting that Sophie is this very lonely, sort of isolated, adrift. She's in her 40s. She's at Knopf. She was born in Vienna, emigrated when she was 12, very loud and gregarious. The people who loved her, and the people who didn't, like Robert Gottlieb, were just like completely put off by her. And she just doesn't fit in at Knopf, which is very like tight, straight-laced and tight-knit and, buttoned up. And everybody's kind of just very quiet and doing their thing. And Sophie's just, out there being Sophie. And she's a wonderful letter writer. And, it was such a delight, frankly, to read as much of her correspondence as I did. But as I'm sort of, reading in semi-real time what's happening with her and Edgar and how they're just like getting into, really NC-17 territory. And I'm just going, no, Sophie, don't do this. And I'm getting so invested in how this is going to work, or it really not. And, they fight a lot, they make up a lot. But somehow this produces Brief Against Death, which is a book, is compelling, even though it's, not very good and is ultimately a false narrative. But it certainly would get the attention of prominent people and reviewers, people like the crime writer Ross MacDonald, who would review it for the New York Times and say, well, I think he might have a case here. And having Buckley as his advocate to go on the Tonight Show and say Edgar Smith is innocent and did not kill Victoria Zelensky, that maybe some other guy did it, who was named at the trial and, of course, did not do it and was wrongfully named and probably had his life ruined as a result. But once I found that correspondence and also Sophie's letters to Buckley, and realized the richness of this correspondence, and that I could sort of track in real time what was going on. And, I will admit that the middle of Scoundrel slows down. It's not as propulsive as the first third or the last third. But I also wanted to convey that if you're a prisoner on death row, your only access to people is by letter. It's very rare that people were allowed in to see Edgar. He only had 1 hour a day outside of his cell, and he could only get a shower once a week. And if you wanted to visit him, either like Buckley, you were affiliated with his lawyer, or like Sophie said, you were his cousin. But media couldn't get in, and it just, you needed alternative ways to do it. So there is this mind-numbing. It's just, being in prison sucks, no matter if you did it, if you didn't do it, if you're on death row, if you're not on death row. It's the opposite of a pleasant experience. And I wanted to convey that day to day of how these sort of delusional fantasies could build up kind of on all sides. And that essentially this intellectual triangle had formed and would be pretty constant for a few years. And then when it broke apart, Buckley and Wilkins were still friends. She would eventually become his first editor on his spy novels. And they would remain friends until the end of her life in 2003. And I really think it's because they were like survivors of a shared war that nobody else could understand and no one else could really talk about in the same way.
I'm curious what, especially because it does, as a contemporary reader, kind of knowing what we know, uh, it seems to me so wild that anyone could think that there was enough of a chance of Smith's innocence to be kind of worth this level of effort, level of investment. So I'm curious. I mean, from Wogan's perspective, especially because she is romantically, sexually drawn to this person, I suppose it makes a degree of sense. But what is the narrative that, if any, that Buckley is trying to push? And is it part of his, like, do you see it as part of his political agenda that there's a kind of good prisoner that we can contrast with those other bad prisoners? Or do you see this as downstream of this sort of personal quality that's nothing to do with his politics of being you write kind of quite movingly about him being like a lovely person in real life in a way that sort of is constantly commented by his friends that he might just be a little naive. Was this a kind of political project for Buckley, or was this something just personal?
I'm inclined to go more with the personal, but I think it couldn't help be political because of who he was. Like anything that Buckley attached his name to became political just by dint of William F. Buckley being attached to it. But I think, the line that I still keep coming back to, and I quoted in the introduction, is from Donald Cox, who wrote the original piece in the National Review, where he told me, we just didn't think that somebody who wrote so well could be a savage killer. And I do think there is that naivete of somebody who is intelligent, who seems cultivated, and particularly for Smith, who was essentially self-taught. And so this idea that he was an autodidact, that he could, like, it's the classic American dream thing of you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that he had gone from being Eddie Smith, ne'er-do-well, shiftless, no prospects, recently married with a young baby who kills this girl in a fit of rage because she rejects his advances. That's a long way from the Edgar Smith who's corresponding with Buckley and talking about, prison reform and schooling Buckley on what's actually happening with Black Americans in prison and why Buckley should actually rethink some of his approaches. I mean, that was also really wild to read, that essentially Edgar Smith had a better handle on criminal justice reform than Buckley ever did. But I also come back to a review that Sam Adler Bell did of my book for the New Republic, and it was a long piece, and it was, I've read it a few times because I think it's just so well written and gave me a lot to think about. But he characterized what was going on between Buckley and Smith as a romance, and without getting into how Buckley related to other men. I mean, we do know that he went skinny dipping with young writers. I mean, Ross Douthat writes about this. And Alex Chi wrote this amazing essay about being a cater waiter for the Buckleys and described some of the things he saw. So, but I think I think whatever was there was so clearly sublimated that I think, first of all, there's no way you could ask Buckley outright what was going on that front. But I do think that just the way that he related to men had this sort of these overtones, these sort of 18th century romance, not necessarily sexual, but just like, men are important. And this is somebody who he thinks is the victim of an extreme injustice. So he's going to do everything he can to help right that wrong, even though it turned out the wrong was prevalent throughout.
And yet, one of the things that's so kind of discomforting in reading, particularly the beginning and the end of your book, is exactly how much the women, the sort of these two cases, Virginia, and the teenage girl whose name escapes me at the end, who we learn is also a kind of victim of an assault.
Kathy, yeah.
That they both get sort of this treatment of they were asking for it, that they were flirtatious. These sort of things are invented about them, both by Smith and then later by the media, even though the official story is not, well, he did it and they deserved it. It's, well, he didn't do it and someone else did, but yet somehow she also did.
Right. Somehow we have to blame the victims nonetheless. I don't think, Buckley will never be forgiven in my mind for the way that he wrote about Victoria Zelensky, just characterizing her as essentially some sex pot. And obviously I quote from it mostly in the epilogue. And interestingly enough, like I always kind of knew that I wanted to end the book with the beginning, with the coda, because I wanted people to understand that Edgar was always kind of like this. And it doesn't mean that he was some monster, fully formed from birth, but I just didn't want to get into the nitty gritty details of his tortured family life because it wasn't as interesting to me. It's like, okay, he did these horrible things. He clearly hated women and girls, and it animated everything that he did and animated all of his rage. And it's really not that exciting or complicated. But to end with Kathy and to also just remind people, you can lose sight that no matter who's involved and the level of public intellectual and media saturation, that a teenage girl was murdered, a 10-year-old was nearly sexually assaulted, and another woman nearly lost her life. And if not, were just for her ability to fight back and sheer force of will, frankly, she would have died too. And so those are the people we need to remember the most. And frankly, I also view people like Sophie Wilkins as victims who were taken in, or Juliet Scheinman, who had a very scary run-in after she, has been corresponding with Edgar, and they have clearly a romantic relationship that's developing, and she's with him after he's released, and then within a few months the relationship is over because he does something that terrifies her, and she's like, I gotta get out of this. They're the people who I thought of uppermost and still think of when I think of my book. And they're the people who matter. And insofar as, however charming and loyal a friend Buckley was, and that his personal relationships merit being written about, but he's not the hero of the story.
And one of the things that fascinated me was that towards the end, you talk about your own brief correspondence with Smith, and but you also choose not to quote extensively from that correspondence. You quote from it a little bit, but you mention in passing, he talked about this. I'd love to hear a little more about both the process, both journalistic of ethical, of that correspondence, and why you made the choices you made in that conversation.
So I mentioned at the top of our conversation that I started corresponding with Smith in 2014, and it was very early in my research and reporting. And I reached out to him to say, I'm working on a project related to Buckley, which is true. And I wanted his input, and just take it from there. I didn't need to necessarily give it away that I wanted to work on a piece about him. And he just writes this screed back. At the time, I still lived in Brooklyn, and I had a P.O. box because I firmly believe if you write prisoners, you should never give them your home address or your phone number. So in the event that we got to the telephone, I had a Google Voice account set up too. But, you have to have levels of safety here. So he writes back and says, oh, I've never corresponded with anyone from Brooklyn. I was near Ebbets Field while I was on the run. It was just like ridiculous. Like, what? it was just baffling. And clearly he was trying to suss out why I was really writing him and what I was after. And I just kept it very minimal. But I was also a little bit pissed off. It was at a time personally when a lot was going on too. So, I try to cop to that as well. And I write back a list of all the people who have died. And that is, I quote from one of his parole board hearings where he talks about all of his ailments and he's kind of surprised that he's still alive. And I said, "Are you still surprised that you're alive?" And his next letter was more contrite. I think, because I had imparted information he didn't know. And after that, I could tell that it just, he wasn't going to tell me that he killed or didn't kill Victoria Zelensky. I already knew. Like, I have court transcripts. I have people that I've spoken with. So I know what his state of mind is. So I just decided to send a list of questions about topics that I didn't think anybody had covered. And then he got, appropriately or not, upset and said, "Clearly you're writing about me, I don't want to cooperate," but then proceeded to answer every single one of my questions. It was like he was compelled to, probably because no one else was writing him letters. I mean, he was old. He was, at that time, 80. He would be dead within 2.5 years. So this was, he was just getting more input when he clearly didn't have any available. And I thought, okay, that's enough. Like, I don't need to belabor the point. I don't need to go visit him. I don't need to do any of this stuff. And at that point, I had also learned, because I had initial correspondence with his second ex-wife, Paige, who then eventually stopped talking to me, which, again, fine. But she made it clear that she would not consent to an interview as long as he was alive. And then when he died, I actually let her know, and I write about this in the book. And then we do have a conversation and we talk, but then she goes dark. I think she'd had some health issues, and I think clearly that it was just too much. But I just, again, didn't think that Edgar was that important in the scheme of things, even though the book is called Scoundrel, and you can't help but gravitate to his orbit. But then again, that's exactly the feeling that Sophie Wilkins had, or William F. Buckley had, or Juliet Scheinman had, or anybody. So I still wanted to approximate that feeling, even as I wanted him to be the least interesting character in the book.
Absolutely. I mean, I think as a reader, certainly like the Wilkins is, I think, emerges as the kind of central emotional figure and through line. Buckley also, I mean, for me, that was sort of there was a curiosity there too of just how these people can delude themselves. And yet something that I was curious about was the degree, like beyond people who knew him or were personally manipulated by him, let's say Buckley and Wilkins, what was there a kind of how did that next level of media narrative work? Was the sort of was there anything particularly politicized about the kinds of outlets that were covering this case? Did this become, because of its association with Buckley, a kind of conservative coded cause, or was it just this a sexy enough story of this sort of self-taught man that it transcended any kind of particular politicized narrative?
I don't think it was a politicized narrative in the way that we would see today. Like, I thought a lot about Edgar Smith when everything was happening with Kyle Rittenhouse, and how, he goes out to these protests, he kills 2 people, and then he becomes a darling of the right-wing media, and is acquitted and just, goes about his merry way, even though eventually he's going to be essentially seduced and abandoned. It was somewhat like that when Edgar gets out. There is this big party that Buckley throws for him, but then all of Edgar's opportunities, there are only so many chances people will give you before you have to kind of make it on your own. Like, you get thrown in the deep end of the pool, you still have to swim.
Yeah.
If you don't swim, well, tough luck. And with Edgar, just he was not really primed to survive in that high society, and eventually, runs into a lot of money trouble. He marries a much younger woman. They move out west. opportunities dry up. And he writes Buckley at one point in 75 that he feels that history is starting to repeat itself, which was very chilling to read sort of in situ in the archives. But the media narratives were, I mean, they were mostly, I mean, Buckley writes about it for Esquire, which, as far as I know, has no outward political leanings. There are pieces written about Brief Against Death in Time, and it's on the Tonight Show, it's on these other talk shows. The New York Times reviews it, the Washington Post reviews it. Like, these are not, again, associated with any particular ideological leanings, even if we might think that they have those leanings now. It's like liberal media was much more centrist. And what was also interesting to me is the backdrop from a criminal justice standpoint against which everything related to Edgar Smith was occurring, because the Supreme Court was liberal leaning, and they were ruling on decisions related to the right to have a lawyer, the right to remain silent, and the fact that Smith's conviction is eventually overturned because his confession is deemed to have been obtained under duress and should not have been introduced as evidence. So once it's thrown out, then they have to retry him. And New Jersey decides that it's not worth retrying, so they'll have him plead guilty to second-degree murder, and he gets time served, and that's how he gets out. Like, it's not like there's an overturned conviction. It's more that he takes the equivalent of the Alfred plea, where essentially, he does admit guilt, but he doesn't have to do anything more. And he did fight against that vociferously, but his lawyers convince him, no, this is as good a deal as you're going to get, and this is how you get out. So it's also so interesting to contrast the Warren Court and their bid to make things more liberal. And then, of course, you have the Civil Rights Act and civil rights movements and just all of the social upheaval, societal upheaval of the 60s. And you contrast it to now, when things are taking a much bigger rightward turn everywhere. And a story like Edgar Smith probably wouldn't happen in the same way at all. And who knows what if a Buckley character was around now. I mean, would he advocate for Smith? That's hard to know. So I wanted to just convey this story and not, hammer home any comparisons per se, but if people wanted to read into stuff, of course, they're welcome to do that.
Well, this is sort of a perfect segue to the sort of second set of questions I have for you, which is about the kind of change in popular perceptions of both true crime and its reflection in crime fiction as well, in the times that you've been reviewing. In particular, let's say, have you kind of, I think there's sort of often broader conversations about, whose stories get told, conversations about, for example, the the beautiful dead girl and the kind of sexualization of certain kinds of victims as opposed to others. What are some of the sort of broader trends that you're seeing in what's being published? Let's say, whatever, answer on whatever time frame makes sense. But how we talk about crime changing?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it sort of depends on where you can date it back. And I talk a lot about true crime in relation to the first season of Serial, which will celebrate its 10th anniversary this fall, because that's the moment when sort of mass culture gloms onto a true crime narrative in a way that it just hadn't done quite in the same way before. So the fact that all these people are paying attention to a podcast, that they're listening week by week, and they want, with bated breath, what's going to happen in the story of the murder of Hae Min Lee? And did not Adnan Syed do it, or was it someone else? And is Sarah Koenig going to land the plane because she's reporting in real time? And it just spawned this entire industry, not just of serial related media, which it did. And the fact that at this current juncture, Adnan Syed is freed from prison. The Baltimore County prosecutor spurred his release because new evidence had come forward that had never been tested. And basically it should have been introduced to trial, and he should never have been tried. But what it also did was kind of reframe true crime for the current day. The fact that it wasn't enough to just listen to a podcast or watch a television show or read a book. that people are now automatically going to go online, find their favorite message board or TikTok person, and start speculating and essentially becoming amateur sleuths. It's not enough to consume. Participation is now key. So that participatory element really, I think, characterizes the ongoing true crime moment that we've been in. With respect to crime narratives, and I'm going to just fold crime fiction in there, I mean, my own first anthology, which was a collection of short stories by women crime writers from the 40s through the 70s, was called Troubled Daughters, Twisted Wives. It definitely benefited from the astonishing success of Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl, which kind of broke the mold in terms of psychological thriller narratives. And, you know, the writing is great. It still, frankly, holds up really, really well. And it just spawned a lot of imitators and knockoffs who were operating in psychological suspense. So here I had this anthology, which essentially was like the grandmothers of Gone Girl. And I could sort of see the bigger picture of why women crime writers in particular were attracted to these narratives, and that there was this third way between, you know, the more cozy detective fiction of cozy I use in a very limited way, but the queens of crime like Agatha Christie and Marjorie Allingham, Dorothy L. Sayers, Ngaio Marsh, and Josephine Tey. And then you had the more hard-boiled American school of the James M. Cains and the Dashiell Hammetts, the Raymond Chandlers of the world. And here there was this third path, which just had never really been talked about as a group, of women writing about domestic horrors, of the fact that the biggest dangers come from the people you love in your own home. And to have that anthology kind of encapsulate it also, I think, created more space for more contemporary psychological suspense and domestic stories, whether you call it domestic suspense or domestic noir. It's, you know, it's all there. And what also ends up happening is that these stories keep being published, but they kind of lose the original flavor of the books that broke the genre mold. So very few people are able to be as incisive about societal changes as Gillian Flynn was. So instead, you had a lot of, well, she's an unreliable narrator. She drinks too much. She's in this nameless, faceless, you know, suburb of somewhere, which has no sense of place and no nothing. And the characters are all whiny and they drink too much and just behave stupidly and are too stupid to live or whatever. So as a reviewer, you know, I'm always looking for the wheat and I have to just get rid of the chaff. And whether it's psychological suspense, or you have something like Richard Osman's The Thursday Murder Club, which also kind of was a mold breaker, and now there are like a million knockoffs. And whatever's next, I guess all the White Lotus type books, because so many writers now are writing these like thrillers that are set in rich people places. And it's just like, okay, I get it, but can we move on now? So this is when there's so many novels that follow trends and you see all of them, it can be a little dispiriting. And that's why whenever something comes along that just either makes its own trend or just does its own thing, it's kind of weird and a little bit unclassifiable. Like, those are my favorite books. I just, you know, I want a good voice. I want a strong sense of place. I want great writing. Like, if you really do have to wow me within the first page. And if you don't, it's not worth my time. Or sometimes what's even more dispiriting is when I'm reading a book and it's competent, but I can see everything beat by beat and I know what's coming. So it's like, why am I even reading this? So these, I mean, these are the pet peeves of a reviewer. But it also, what's interesting is when I'm working on my own books, and for now it's been mostly nonfiction, all of that kind of falls away. I mean, I have enough also publishing industry experience of having been a book publishing reporter for a long time. So I know a lot about book publishing. But when I'm writing my books, all of that goes away and it's just me alone with the page. And that can't change because you still have to produce an amazing book, the best of your ability, and challenge yourself and strive to better yourself from the last project and go in different directions. And so after Scoundrel, you know, I wanted to work on a project that kind of moved even more into what I think of as the public interest and involved like gender and women's issues, and is a little more of a legal drama and a media drama, but also tries to center the people at the center of the narrative. And I'm hoping that's just what I'm always able to do. And it's certainly what I'm always hoping to read, whether it's in fiction or nonfiction, or in crime fiction or in true crime.
So now that you have raised the subject, what can you tell us about this next project?
So for the last few years, I've been working on a book. The provisional title is Without Consent. The subtitle has changed a lot. What's interesting too is both the subtitles for the Real Lolita and Scoundrel changed between hardcover and paperback for publishing reasons. So I think the current subtitle for Scoundrel is now the true story of a murderer who charmed his way to fame and freedom, which is also good. It just sends a different note to paperback readers than the hardcover one did. In any case, so Without Consent is about a trial that took place in December of 1978. And it was the first time that a woman, her name was Greta, charged her husband, whose name was John, with rape while they were still living together as husband and wife. And because a marital rape case had not made it to trial that people knew of, it isn't totally true, but considering it was 78, only 4 years before, so 50 years ago exactly, marital rape was not a crime anywhere in the United States. So it was perfectly legal to rape your spouse. And so as a result, this case involving two very young people, Greta was 23, John was about to turn 22, in Salem, Oregon, becomes a media circus. And, all three networks are there with cameras. They don't allow them in the courtroom, but they're, just outside. Tons of coverage from newspapers and magazines and international outlets. And he's acquitted. And within 2 weeks, they get back together briefly because, there's this cycle of intimate partner violence. And the country kind of turns against Greta. There's so many bad op-eds and hot takes. And this is, early 79. But even with this acquittal, it did spur every state to criminalize spousal rape. A number of them still have loopholes, and only a few are being fixed. In fact, I think just this month, Ohio will finally get rid of the spousal rape loopholes, and it's signed into law. It's 2024. Like, what are we even doing here? But as a result, it's not a history story. It feels even more of a contemporary story, especially after Dobbs, that when women's bodily autonomy is under threat and when rights are being taken away, there's no constitutional right to abortion. There's a lot of talk about criminalizing birth control, about maybe getting rid of no-fault divorce. Well, what's next? Probably spousal rape. This idea that, what do you mean it's a crime to rape your wife? You can do whatever you want. And I've even heard some of that on social media. It's just like, we're in this strange time where things are regressing. And it's important to look at stories that remind us that there was activism and that all the battles still have to be waged, even when we think we win them.
Yeah. So that's incredibly chilling I don't think I'd realized quite how late and unstable marital rape laws were as part of the kind of public and legal infrastructure. So my last question for you is about evil. It's not something sort of nice and small. But I'm particularly interested in. So what I love about what is sort of broadly construed as crime fiction is the way that sort of these questions of good and evil can be explored in this kind of intense way because we're cranking everything up to 11. I think Dostoevsky is one of my favorite novelists and is very much working within that tradition. And yet I'm curious whether as kind of cultural attitudes towards evil or a sense of what evil is and where it comes from changed, and how does that reflect is that reflected in writing about crime, both fiction and nonfiction, from let's say this is different perspectives one might have could be like, this is demons, this is the sort of Catholic exorcist movie model. You have kind of certain kinds of ideas that evil might come from a place of trauma or intergenerational trauma. or that it's sort of something that kind of comes through societal structures. There's sort of so many ways we can think about how evil comes into the world. Do you see sort of broad trends in approaches to like where evil comes from in the books that you review and write about, or is it just a sort of author by author perspective?
I think it is an author by author perspective. And I think also I can't help but read books according to my own lens, and my own sense of good and evil is that I don't necessarily believe in good people and evil people. I think that you live your life and if you do more good things than bad things, then I guess you're on the quote good side of the ledger. And if you do more evil things than not so evil things, then you're going to be on the evil side of the ledger. But that so much of life is about the decisions you make. And I am a huge believer in free will. It's not that you are born predestined to do stuff. There is this complicated relationship between nature and nurture, and between choice and circumstance. And that, yes, the society in which you are born into and grow up in affects outcomes very differently. Like I, as a privileged white lady, will have very different probable outcomes than someone who is Black and growing up in a poor socioeconomic household. That's just a given. So with those factors, what produces good decisions versus bad decisions? But that said, I think of somebody like John Connolly, who very overtly does explore good and evil in his work. And, I would probably classify him more as like supernatural, kind of horror, but not. But I bring him up because he kind of predates a lot of the resurgence in horror fiction. And I don't think it's an accident that horror has really taken off again as a genre. It was really marginalized for a while, particularly, I think, since Trump got elected in 2016, that people were like, I don't know how to deal with the real traumas in day to day, so I'm going to sublimate it in fiction and work it out there. And of course, there's a huge appetite for readership for horror fiction in the same way that crime fiction right now, I would say that, quote, cozy narratives, or, softer boiled, where the murders are not so grisly and overt, that's having a resurgence. You have the Thursday Murder Club books, you have Nita Prose. There is this appetite because people want to escape. Some people want to escape, but with lighter fare. Some people want to escape by really leaning the hell into trauma narratives and horror. And explorations of good and evil are going to be along that entire spectrum as a result.
Makes a lot of sense. Right, so we have time. I think we have actually time for one more question, which I'm excited to be able to ask you, which is about your own ethical approach as you deal with this sort of material. Both, I'm curious also how writing, sort of your experience of writing Real Lolita and how that played into questions of what questions do you ask? What do you not ask? How do you draw attention to certain things without kind of lovingly, cherishingly drawing attention in a fetishistic way? How do you talk to survivors or families of victims and balance the different obligations you might have as a human being or a person or a witness and as a writer or a journalist? How do you approach that whole set of questions?
I think what it comes down to is that as a journalist, as a book writer, I can never forget, nor should I, that I am approaching people who have experienced the worst thing in their lives, whether they were victims themselves, let's say sexual assault survivors, or family members of victims of crimes, be they murder victims or sexual assault victims. I'm coming in as a journalist, kind of parachuting in, asking questions and trying to be as empathetic as possible. And doing so, like, I had to kind of learn this for myself, that sometimes you need to have multiple conversations off the record before they'll agree to be interviewed. Sometimes you do have to just cross your fingers and hope that they'll talk to you. But that, there are going to be reverberations because they are living with this trauma every single moment of their lives. And it does not, leave them. I can come in, do the interview, leave, and then go about my day. I think a lot about, too, is what's the responsibility to people I talk to sources after a book's published. Like, how often do people want me to check in on them? Do they want it at all? And I think what has sort of happened naturally, especially with the people I spoke with for the Real Lolita is that I would check in periodically and they would check in with me. And then, eventually would lie fallow because they want to go back to their day-to-day lives. But I just think that prioritizing compassion and empathy whenever possible, but also recognizing that this work takes a toll on me. And this new book in particular, like I really had to take a lot of breaks and kind of restore myself and make sure my mental health was sound and my physical health was good and that I was doing nice things for myself. And that's important because if you are not in a good state and are well fortified, you cannot do this work. And there have been a lot of discourse, especially about should you be watching people who die in war or in like victims of atrocities, and people who work in those fields are like, I do this for a living, you should not be watching this. And I take that tack too. Like I don't go out of my way to watch, say, people who are killed by police, or people who died in atrocities, because frankly, I already know what I know from reading it. I don't need to put myself in a PTSD spiral so I can be a better person off of somebody's trauma. So with that in mind, it's really important in reporting it that you just tell the story as best as you can and don't devolve into trauma porn and don't sensationalize. And remember that there are other narratives and stories to tell that aren't just about beautiful dead white girls, that there's a whole spectrum of trauma and loss that we don't know nearly enough about. But at the same time, that leaning into joy and good things does not make you a poorer person and or a poorer reporter. That all of it, it's like you have to have all of it in order to do your best work. And by the same token, that people who've experienced trauma and loss, they can laugh, they can, do fun things and live their lives. That people are complicated, life is very complicated, and reflecting that complexity is incredibly important.
Thank you so much for being here, Sarah. I know you have to go tonight, so I will let you go. But I really appreciate your time. I loved your book. When this is on YouTube, there will be an order link. So if you are watching this via YouTube, check the description. A link will be there. Buy Scoundrel. Buy all of Sarah's books, and enjoy the rest of your day wherever any of you are, and enjoy the rest of your evening, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Tara. This was lovely and wonderful.
But great rest. Have fun in Brooklyn. Cheers.
I will. You take care.